Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's program is part of the 2020 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Beyond Borders and the book Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. For more information on other virtual programs, including book discussions, author events, workshops, and more, visit onebookonechicago.org. In the book Exit West, traveling vast physical distances is as easy as walking through a door, but overcoming cultural distance is often much harder. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome some very special guests from DePaul University: Abdul Malik Ryan, Chijane Yin, Mark Turkett, and Shelja Sharma for a discussion on how we can come together. Thanks to the Chicago Public Library Foundation, Bank of America, Union Pacific, and United Airlines for their support in making this season of One Book, One Chicago possible. This program is co-sponsored by our longtime partners, DePaul University. Our thanks to DePaul University Department of English, John Shanahan, David Welsh, and Maya Burris for continuing this partnership, especially in these challenging times. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's conversation, Shelja Sharma. She's a professor of international studies and the founding director of the Refugee and Forced Migration Program at DePaul University. Her areas of research include migration and forced migration. Please join me in welcoming Shelja, Abdul Malik, Chijane, and Mark to the CPL virtual stage.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Beyond Borders, a discussion of Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. Um, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Maya Burris and Crystal Lewis from DePaul University for all their work on putting this event together. And without further ado, let's get started by introducing our panelists. Um, I'm very happy to introduce Chi Jang Yin, who is Associate Professor at DePaul University and area head of photography and media art at the art school. Her teaching and research examine the cultural foundations of nuclear power and US gun violence, focusing on the use and misuse of media to alter bias and understanding. Yin is a trained diversity facilitator at the National Seed Project, founded by Peggy McIntosh and the Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College. She also serves as the chair of Promotion and Tenure Policy Committee to support the equitable opportunity and accessibility of the faculty's promotional process. Professor Yin is the Presidential Fellow at DePaul University this year and works with DePaul University President and Vice President for Institutional Diversity and Equity, creating research to address diversity and inclusion issues. She will be talking today on the symbolic interpretation of magical doors in Exit West. Our second speaker is Professor Mark Turcott, who is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, is the author of several poetry collections, including Exploding Chippewas and The Feathered Heart. He teaches in the English department at DePaul. He'll be talking about The Story is the Story. And our third speaker is Abdul Malik Ryan. Abdul Malik Ryan graduated from DePaul University and accepted Islam while an undergraduate at DePaul. He then did a graduate degree from Georgetown University Law Center and worked for 14 years at the Cook County Public Guardian's Office, representing children in the child protection system. He has served as an imam for the Inner City Islamic Center and has been the president of the board of directors of Iman, the Inner City Muslim Action Network. He has been the Muslim chaplain at DePaul since 2009 and teaches a class on the history of Muslim communities of Chicago, and is married to Muna Malik, a fellow DePaul alum, and with her has 5 kids. And he's going to be talking about Li Tarafu, so that you may know another, and Hijra, which means migration, a Muslim reflection on Mohsin Hamid's Exit West. So let's get started. And I'm going to ask Professor Chijang Yin to talk to us for a little bit about her view of the novel. Chijang, over
Thank
to
you
you.
so much. Okay, thank you so much, you all. It's such a great honor to have a discussion about this book. My takeaway of the insight of this book is about the magical door. It's fascinating to read through all this kind of passage and the symbolism of how the magical door is not about a specific space, but is in between space. And he's keep emphasizing in different kind of passage. So for example, right here, there's a quote. In this group, everyone was foreigner. And so, in a sense, no one was. So it's a fascinating in terms of to look into is either or situations and either or kind of identity and it's in between of this space. And then also there's another quote I found that is very insightful. And that quote is directly come from the idea about nations. It said, without borders, nations appear to be becoming somewhat illusory, and people were questioning what role they have to play. So I think it really brings out a lot of insight in terms of what identity is about, how identity is related to the constructions of a nation or the expectation of the nation. And at the same time is very illusory and very fluid. Thank you.
Mark?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm glad to be here. You know, I have to be in my usual position, which is mostly as poet, native writer, I guess, and poet. And I really approached this book in that way. But so my topic or my sort of title for what I was going to say right now is The Story is the Story. And that essentially is kind of a native idea, not entirely native. Lots of people share this idea, but that we are all operating under a story that we were born into and that we've been handed and we've been a part of for a long, long time, you know, since our origins. And then things happen in our lives. We have encounters in our lives, other people enter our lives, and they bring story with them into our lives. And I thought this book, in a weird way, was a really accurate sort of illustration of that idea. You know, at first I thought the door, these magic doors were going to be just an idea, you know, just a fantasy or a hope. So I was really surprised, and you forgive me, this is my first Hamid book, so maybe I wouldn't have been surprised if I had read more, but I was surprised that the doors were really there, that they really existed. And I expected them, you know, this book defied me at every turn. I was surprised to see that the door came out where it came out, and, you know, to another troubled space. And so that happening again and again seemed to just be a really good illustration of this idea that we are always encountering new narratives. We are always crossing borders that we're not even aware of. And I think also, too, this book illustrates like the borders between people. You know, Nadia and Saeed end up sort of encountering their own borders with each other and boundaries. And so I found that compelling. But I'm really interested to hear what other folks are thinking about this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Abdul Malik, tell us your perspective on the novel.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here with everyone. You know, one thought that I had when I was reading it was Arafu, which comes from a Quranic verse, which talks about how we created you from a single male and female, and we made you into shu'ub wa kaba'ila. We made you into peoples and tribes. There's different ways to pronounce it, peoples and groups or clans. So, I mean, to translate it. So sometimes it's translated nations and tribes, and these have implications, but obviously when the Quran is revealed is long before there's an idea of a nations. But we made you into these peoples and tribes, and so that you might know one another, lita'arafu, so that you might recognize each other, you might get to know one another. And this is a really powerful idea because I think it speaks to this question. And I think in reading the novel and in hearing even Mohsen Hamid talk about it, it brings up this idea of are people fundamentally the same, or are they fundamentally, and what do we emphasize? And I think one thing he talked about is the mechanism of what they often use to differentiate people. You often hear people when they talk about refugees or immigration saying, well, borders are real things and nations have to have borders, and they really seem to emphasize that we can't deny these things. But of course, in a very real sense, they are completely imaginary. They are, you can't see a border, you can't see these places. So, and we know they didn't always exist in the places they are now, and they are constructed. So the question is, but at the same time, so the question is, he said, by making this door and taking away the journey and the trip, even though that is an important part of many people's migration experience, you kind of take away this ability to have that distance you from the other person. If it's just someone walking through a door, then it's fundamentally similar to you. And I think what happens in this Quranic verse is that it recognizes we are all one common human family, and it recognizes this common human need for connection, for bridging. I mean, whenever you meet people, I think there's a common human desire to find some kind of connection. You might say, I'm from this place, or and someone will say, oh, I visited that place once, or I know someone from that place. And in reality, it may be a very superficial connection, but people always want to find these connections. And I think what the Quran is doing here, and which was very important at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, was knowing your genealogy back many places, and knowing it in your head, so that when you met someone, when he traveled, when he met different tribes, he could say, tell me your genealogy, and then he would find where their genealogies met. And then he would say, so we're basically related to each other. So this idea that all humans are basically related, but at the same time, our differences are also real. And our differences are not accidental in a sense. God is saying here that our differences are part of a divine plan, that they're sacred. So both our commonalities as a human family and our differences are both sacred, and recognizing them is both sacred. Quickly, the other point is the hijra point. Maybe we'll talk more about. This idea of hijra is the migration of the Prophet Muhammad. So it becomes a fundamental aspect of the Muslim story. And part of what my practice of Islam is similar to what we're saying about living in the story, is that your practice is always thinking about not just the divine, but thinking about the past, and thinking about Mecca, and thinking about the Prophet Muhammad. And you're always living in two spaces at once. You're always living in different times at once. And this is, of course, greatly more made clear for those who are migrants. And the majority of the Muslim community in the United States still are people who are immigrants. People who were not born in the United States. And that's changed, but that's still the case, even though the largest single group is the African American community, which has been here and has their own story. But the largest overall, the majority of people overall, are still people who were born in other places. So the last thing that I want to mention is so hijra is really important. And I think when people come here and migrate, one idea I found interesting is that often when the first migrants come, they want to make the door to their mosque or their community centers or the groceries like one of these magic doors, where when they go through it, they're back in the place that they came from, and they speak their language, and they have their foods, and everything is the way they remember nostalgically where they came from. And that often poses a tension with their children, who don't recognize those places and who feel foreign through those doorways, and who feel disconnected. So that's always an issue that comes up. But the fundamental aspect of the love story and the way it is I think one aspect of the book that's hard to avoid, is that the book is fundamentally, in many interviews, I see him using the word optimistic, and people talking about the optimism of the book. But I don't like the word optimistic. I think it has other connotations for me. But I think it is a fundamentally hopeful book. It's a hopeful book. But the reason I don't like optimistic is so many horrible things happen. And even the love story itself they don't end up together. But it's hopeful in that, despite the loss and despite the idea of transience and loss that permeates the novel, there's still an idea that things are still meaningful and beauty is still there and connections can still be made, even in the face of knowing that loss will eventually occur. And that's, to me, that's an attitude of hopefulness rather than an attitude of optimism.
That's very interesting. Let me say a couple of things about, what I saw was, interested me about the novel was, I sensed like a real tension in it between the historical and local particulars of the novel story. The urban setting of the home city where a lot of the novel takes place. Initially when I started reading it, to me it was clear this was like Karachi because it's a seaside city, but it's also a hyper localized city that, he talks about it as a refugee city, and it's a city that's been settled by refugees in the wake of the partition of British India. Um, and then it transforms itself into a really general city that's being attacked by anonymous militants. And I wonder why the author felt the need to render the story universal and still at times rooted it in a very local historical perspective. Is it because he wants us to read our stories of displacement into the fates of Nadia and Saeed, or because he's experimenting with a genre that is not really a novel but more in the nature of a fable? So that was sort of one tension I read into it. And I also felt this tension in how he described different spaces. I've already talked about Karachi, but London is very solidly imagined. So is Mykonos. But then when it comes to San Marine, Marine County, it becomes a little bit too generic. It becomes like the fog, the sea, the weed, and I just said, I saw the trajectory of the novel as one of like widening generalization and universalism, and the story of Nadia and Saeed goes from being, really sort of rooted in the earth of Karachi to becoming really like global. And again, I can see what he's doing. I just wonder why he's doing that. Um, and then the last thing I'll mention is the role of surveillance in the novel. I mean, that really struck me. When Saeed and Nadia are in Karachi, they use their phones really sparingly, but technology sort of enters with the militants, in a very malignant form when violence breaks out. But when they get to Mykonos and then to London and then to California, there are constant references to drones and surveillance, to intrusion, to penetration. To the extent there's that one scene when Saeed comes in with a little drone that catches and they bury it together. Similarly, I think the use of doors is magical at one level, but another level it's really easy. It's like Star Trek, beam me up, Scotty kind of thing. So is Hamid suggesting that borders are actually those between bodies and machines and not the ones between countries? Um, and that natives and migrants are actually not that different because they're both being surveilled by these anonymous sources up there in the sky. We never know who is looking at them. So anyway, so those were the things that struck me. And having said that, I'm just going to open up the novel for a discussion amongst the speakers. Um, Maybe, Chijang, I'll start sort of by returning to the summary that in your summary you talked about the idea of nations and how nations are very illusory in the novel. Could you talk a little bit about that? And if they are illusory, like what is the role of nations in this novel? Just
What is the nation's you mean the relation between identity and the nation in this novel?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Um, I
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I actually very much appreciate a couple points that you mentioned. One is about the universalism, and then another point is talk about this stranger, this part of unknown fear of the civilian keep watching them. And if there's a particular quote that related to that, I thought is fascinating. Is oh, when we migrant, we murder our lives, those we left behind. I mean, there's so much in terms of the insight about where exactly the location that he's talking about as the couples is. I think the point that you mentioned right here is great. It's about the displacement, but it's beyond that. Is they both trying to search for their identity, and identities as a couples and identities as individual. And but then at the same time, they're trying to cope with the nation's expectations. They saw some, wealthy peoples around. They saw some refugees around, and they're trying to affiliate with a different group. And then at the end, there is certain kind of disappointment and excitement, everything going on. And then the door happened again, and then to move on to another nation. So I, I think, the way that you mentioned about universalism is interesting because it is London and, the US, yes, there's similarity. It is about, the white society, majority wise. And I'm curious about his choice. Why these two places? There's tons of other global city that could pick out from, right? So it's not just simply about these two places, but I felt like it's the symbolism of what these two places represent against or very different from their own identities. So actually that got back to Abdul Malik, if I pronounce it correctly. I really appreciate your insight when you mentioned about the Muslim religion, of how the idea of the God, the scripture, is tightly connected to the daily life and also tightly connected to the concept of this book. Maybe related to that, I would love to hear about your insight on that, Adu Malik.
Thank you. Thank you, Chijang. Mark, I'm going to turn to you now. Feel free to respond to Chijang, but I think maybe Abdul Malik wants to say something before that. And
No, I just would, in response to that, I do think that is a fascinating idea. And also, there's this, similar to the way that the city, and whether it's Karachi is where my wife is from actually, or whether it's Lahore, which is where the author is from, I think it has elements of different ones. And obviously he purposely didn't make it, but yet it's part of that unnaming, but still naming enough characteristics. Like he never actually says they're Muslim or uses any specific terms of Islam, but yet it's still clear that you're going to think that maybe because of his background, but also because of things like call to prayer and the robe that she wears and all these kind of, and the militants and all these kind of things, which people may associate with Islam, but can also be wider and more universal. But so I think it's an interesting continuation of that universal. And I also find it very interesting that he talks very eloquently at times about the spirituality of Said, about his prayer, especially. He talks about his prayer and what prayer means for him. And he talks very eloquently about that, but it stands out to me. And I think this is something that's hard to do in art, but I don't know what else to make of it. He mentions his prayer, how his prayer connects him to his family, and his prayer connects him to his father, and his prayer connects him to his mother, even after they're gone, and how his prayer helps him to deal with trauma and loss and connects him to his transience in this world and the fact that he's going to die. But it never talks about God. Like it doesn't say God, I felt connected to God, or I prayed to God for this, or anything like that. And then we know Nadia doesn't pray at all. So I think, and I also was very moved, even though it's such a quick reference, to her relationship with her own family and her striking out on her own, in the sense that she missed them and they missed her, but they neither could reach out, just based on a fundamental disagreement and understanding of who they were. So I think those things are very profound. And I really think I know that the author has talked about how this kind of fundamental recognition of impermanence and death is there, and how do people deal with that, either if they still have a connection to religion or if they don't have a connection to religion. So there's a lot more there, but I want to let Mark get in for a second. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark, I think...
Thanks. Everything that... Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to say we are all talking about borders and people, which is exactly what you started us off on. So if you'd like to weigh in on that.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'm forgetting everything I wanted to say because what you're all saying is so fascinating. Especially Malik, I was aware the whole time I was reading this book that I wasn't being taught. Often when I read a book that's very much I think it's from a culture very different than mine, I expect that I'm going to be immersed. And sometimes that's why people read books like that, is they want to be immersed. And one of the things I liked about it is there was no immersion. There were just glimpses for me. As I have Muslim friends, but I don't really know that much about their religious lives. Just like my Christian friends, I don't know that much about their religious lives. And I could never begin to guess their city of origin. But I thought that was being done sort of almost in this generic way, no matter where they end up, these two people, Saeed and Nadia, because it's about them. It's not about the destinations. There's sort of like no journey. That's an odd thing, because often stories are about a journey. And in this case, the journey is just an accumulation of a bunch of destinations, which is a really strange way to get somewhere, right? To arrive at someplace. And I can't help but lay this book and this narrative, let's say, over top of America, what we think of as America, because right now, all of this stuff is very much in our faces in America. Malik said, well, any two people who would encounter each other, naturally, they want to discover something about each other that they can learn and that they have in common. And I think we're sort of in a place in America where two people encounter each other and they're looking for how they are different, or at least one of those people is looking for how they are different, or how the person they're encountering is different. And then, of course, I can't help but, as a native person, to think about this strange idea of like assimilation is somewhere underneath this. And there's no real assimilation going on. But I come from a culture, obviously, where we sort of had no choice. So in a way, if we could say, if I just forget the Irish Scots side of my heritage, I come from a people who are not migrants. And everyone stepped through a magical door and ended up in my house, in my land, if you know what I mean. So that was a real interesting way to approach this, and I couldn't help but think about it. But also, I felt so many things that were that felt like they were in common with this sense of being in a place where you might not be welcome. You're really not sure. You're always on edge. And, most Native people I know, once we get away from our communities and, at a certain point, if you're really immersed in a Native community, when you leave that, you say you're going to America. It's that idea, like America is this other place. So we, are often not sure how welcome we are or how to behave. And certainly encounters we have with the inhabitants of America, of what has become America, have no real good idea of how to deal with us either. So I don't know, I just thought it was a really interesting predicament. I'm sorry I can't really help but apply it to, my native experience in America.
And
Can I do a follow up on that?
yeah, of course.
Yeah. Actually, when I was reading this particular quote about group, about everyone was foreigner, and in a sense that no one was, I was actually, when I saw your bio, I thought about, of course, it's a generalization of Native Americans. I was thinking about, from, this kind of generation, this kind of experience of someone who actually belong to this land, but then in a way that because of the narrative of the nation that creates it, it become not really much belong to the land. So I was actually very interest in terms of your perspective is, you're right. Majority of the people, I mean, the same as Abdul Malik's subject, comment as well. Majority of the people in America right now, they're immigrant, but some like yourself, it is localized. It is here, but then at the same time, again, it's a generalization of thinking. So how much the feeling of belonging actually, instill and capable to be solidified under current narrative of what is America?
Sure. Well, to be clear, that quote about everybody being a foreigner fit perfectly into what I'm thinking, actually, because there is that sense of everyone is a foreigner. There's a land, there's a place, let's just call it the land, that might be unoccupied by people, and then it is occupied by people, and the people who it's occupied by, they think of it as their land, and then other people show up, and do they belong to that landscape in the same way that the other people do? And all of a sudden, has the landscape been taken over so that it's not even what it was originally? I mean, this is a really interesting dynamic. And I think, we could lay this over everybody's sort of origins really easily, all of us. It's just really fascinating. I was surprised. I'm sorry, in a good way. I was really surprised by this book and the places that it took me. And there was a part of me, Malik, that was thinking, I want to do some research. I want to do some, but I told myself not to do that. I wanted to just encounter it with what I was being given by the author. Maybe because I'm a writer, I have this sense. It sort of irritates me when people read my poems and they stop in the middle to look up a word or research, or find out what somebody else thought of my poem, or you know what I mean. And my students like to do that. They can hardly encounter anything without finding out what somebody else thought about it. So right now I'm doing that. I'm finding out what other people thought about it. It's a fascinating idea. It's a little spooky how much it lays on top of the U.S. right now.
Yeah, I think everybody has this issue of identity and belonging in the front of their mind, especially this month and the next. But Jijang, I want to go back to one thing that you had mentioned about nations, and it suddenly struck me as I was listening to you that Hamid does not refer to any of the places in his novel in terms of nations. We always get an island, a city, a county, but never does he say Pakistan or Greece or England or the United States, which I think is significant, but I'm not sure how that is significant. So on the one hand, you have the universal, and on the other, the hyper localism of how he identifies places. I'm not sure how that is significant, but it did strike me as you were speaking. But I also thought, to go back to Abdul Malik's notion of hijrat or migration. In some ways, this book is about migration, and at another level, it's about the love story between Nadia and Saeed. And Abdul Malik, you said, this book is about connections. But then when I started thinking about that, it suddenly struck me that Nadia and Saeed actually lose their connection as they keep going westward. Um, they do find other connections, but this sort of fundamental connection that they have gets dissolved. Um, do you think this is related to hijra, or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that the the book is just so in many ways the book is so generous, I think, and compassionate to so many people. I mean, I think the book really does search for this universality, and that's why it goes to the point of even trying to sympathize to some extent with the experience of people who lived in these places where all these other people started arriving, and how they might feel frightened or how they might feel unsure of how to respond to it. And there's at one point where even Saeed is like, says we shouldn't be stealing from this house in London where we're living, and Nadia is like, no, of course we can. Like she thinks that's preposterous, but I think there is this kind of fundamental generosity, and I think it goes back to this universalism, even at the point of saying, that long passage about the woman who lived in Marin County in the same house her whole life, and how, and even though she lived in the same house her whole life, she was a migrant too, because she migrated through time and everything changed around her. And I think, going back to your point, there's really this sense. I think there's a sense even in reading the novel, there's a sense of going into the future, and there's a sense of starting in our time, but then going into the future. And that's one reason I think county part is a little more unclear and vague, because I think it's already like something in the future. It's already something that's going to be made different than it is now by all these migrants, and it's going to be changed. And I think there's a sense, especially when you're thinking of these old cities like Lahore or even Karachi, like that these cities last on, or London, that these cities are bigger and longer than any political division, that countries change, that there's partition of India, there's independence, but those cities were still there through all of it. And in the future, when I think he's really envisioning a future where there aren't nation states, maybe where there aren't that isn't the definition, that I think he's talked very powerfully about this idea that eventually people will come to realize that it just doesn't make any sense to give someone fundamentally different rights based on where they were born, that some people have these magical set of privileges and rights because of where you happen to be born in, do not have those rights because they happen to be born. So I think if you're envisioning that kind of future, you really are envisioning the nation state kind of no longer being a reality. But I like this. The question I had about this idea of hijra too is like, when you have this generosity in trying to make these experiences of migration universal, how do we square that? Again, going back to my theme of both recognizing commonalities, but also recognizing difference. How do we square that with the fact that migration of certain kinds is a different experience, and it does produce certain types of people, and others do have privileges, and I mean, I always think that there is a special, there's a special kind of person that does migrate. I mean, obviously sometimes you're very much forced by circumstances, but still, it is still not everyone that has that experience, or everyone that has that. For I think the author in his own life, and for these characters, like I was shocked as someone who hasn't moved countries in my life, even though I was shocked when they left London after all they were working to build, and just all of a sudden were like, let's go to a new place. Like, I think there is a different type of human personality that would have the courage to do that would have the courage to strike out new. So what is different? And the last thing I'll mention along those lines of what's different and what's the same, and your point, which I think is really good, about them separating from each other and them becoming different from each other in these environments. I do wonder if there's, and I did feel, based on my own experiences and kind of thing, I did wonder, I think it's hinted at, but then at the end, I think it's more attributed to their personality. But I think, especially at one stage, it almost seems as like a gendered thing, where she feels much, she doesn't feel the same nostalgia for the place that she came from, I think, because she didn't have the same relationship with her family. That was torn apart. She didn't have the ability to be who she wanted to be, even though she forced that upon herself. She struck out that upon herself, but it was very difficult in the society that she lived in. So she both did better relating to totally different people in London and the Nigerians and stuff, whereas Said was kind of drawn to being around people from his country. And I think you see in migrant communities those tendencies as well, the tendency to want to stay close to those who are like you, but also the tendency of others to, because they have this migrant personality, to totally branch out to new things and experience new things. And how those both come, and in this, they just had different ways of course he ends up marrying it seems like an African-American woman. So he's at the end, Saeed is very adventurous, and you can see that in his personality, but he just age of the novel where he's drawn to that kind of familiarity and nostalgia, I think.
Thank you. I think we are out of time, and I'm going to turn this back over to Jennifer so we can take questions from the audience and listeners who are following this broadcast.
Great. Yes, we got some great questions that have come in. The first one from Josh is, what do you think is the function of the magic element in the book, and does that make the message more accessible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does many different things. I think it takes out certain aspects, but at the same time, so it makes you highlight certain aspects. So by taking out the physical manifestation of migration, it focuses just on the emotional pain and separation rather than putting it even in a physical context. But I would also say I think the magic may contribute to just making it very readable and very like enticing to the reader. And you know, horrible things are happening, and it does have that fable-like quality though, where things are just kind of told matter of factly, and you're rooting for the characters and you want the characters to do well, even when these things are being described that are very fantastical and very unusual, but it's still rooted in the realities of real, you know, suffering and pain. So it's the mix of that, somehow it makes it move very fast and seem very meaningful and powerful, the story, I think, as a whole.
I'm going to ask Mark to try and answer that as a writer. I mean, clearly the choice of magic is a very deliberate one. Why do you think Hamid works with this idea of magic?
Well, if I look at it strictly as a writer, I could envision having a conversation with somebody who is trying to write this narrative that they have in mind, and they want these people to travel, to be migrants, but you'll need 1,000 pages to portray all of the migrations, you know, all of the journeys. Like I said, there's no real journey, just destination. So then somebody else sitting around the table says, I know, magic doors. How about magic doors? Then you don't have to worry about all the travel. I mean, I hope that doesn't seem cynical, but it's a lot of, you know, how that stuff happens sometimes.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to do it is, I didn't really think of them as magic doors until you folks started calling them magic doors. And I thought, well, what does it do? It brings magic, a really obvious magic to the story, you know, as a writer. And I think it's really clever. It's really, really clever. It does a lot of good work. What you said earlier, Malik, about doors, that some people want to step through the door this way, then they want to step back in the other way. And that goes on with all of us in our families, you know, like if, you know, I'm sure, you know, like if I grew up part of my life on the reservation and then part of it not on the reservation, and then I have children who are going to be less connected to my home reservation, and they will have children who will think of the reservation as some distant place, perhaps, you know, and you have to do a lot of work to keep those connections. So especially here in so-called America, these dynamics happen. I see this among my students at DePaul all the time, because we're, you know, fairly diverse, you know, compared to a lot of campuses. And my students have this story. Well, my parents are disappointed because I'm not as Ukrainian as they are, or my parents are disappointed because I'm not, you know, whatever, you know, as Assyrian as they are, right? And it's sort of impossible for them to be as Assyrian as their parents, you know? So it's an interesting dynamic, I think. I mean, this book can be laid over top of a lot of ideas, a lot of metaphors. Thanks.
Kimberly asks, given that Nadia didn't pray or appear religious, are there any thoughts on why she continued to wear her traditional clothing?
Oh,
yeah. Go ahead.
it's so interesting, because when I was reading it, it's more about at the beginning. It's, if I understand correctly, it's the gender issue. Before, you know, all this, you know, the meetings happened, she mentioned about she was wearing that is because she wanted to protect her own body. She doesn't want to have any kind of men to take advantage of it. Even though she mentioned about she doesn't play. I mean, she doesn't pray. So that is my take of it. Is another way of assuring her own safety. But yes, Abdul Malik, so, please.
I think it certainly starts that way, but there is sort of a point in the novel that even Saeed wonders why she's continuing to wear the robe, and he questions it, and he has very ambivalent feelings towards the robe, right? He even as Nadia is really adventurous and is open to people in all the different places they are, there is a way in which she sticks to her identity, which is that of the woman with the black robe. And at the end of the novel, when they meet back in the city of origin, she's still wearing the robe. So there is a way in which the robe has become Nadia, right? I mean, Nadia's made the robe a part of herself, and I'm not sure why that is, but I think it goes beyond that of sort of protecting herself. When he asks her at the beginning, why do you wear the robe if you don't pray? And she says, it's so that men don't, F word with me. Surely that's not the case at the end of the novel, and yet she continues to wear it. So I'm not sure I know the answer to that, Kimberly. But I think there's much more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah, I think all those comments are very powerful and help me think through it. I think there's this idea, why does she? I mean, she's asked why she does it, and she says why she does it, but at the same time, I think the idea. So I think why she does it should be is up to her, and it's something she's claiming, and I think he's striking against this idea, which I think is very common both outside of the Muslim community or inside the Muslim community, and I'm sure it's true for other communities, that it means one certain thing, that but it can mean totally different things to different people. And I think the last comments really make me even think more. It could even mean different things to the same person over time. It could come to mean something different to her over time than it meant originally. But the key is, and this is part of this connecting and crossing borders with people, not to assume that what something means for someone, even something that seems to be giving off a message, but you may be misinterpreting that message, or you may be, if you leave her alone, I guess you're getting the message she wants you to, but maybe not for the exact right reason. So yeah.
That's great.
Maybe it's a little bit about oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it's a little bit about this idea that a couple people have broached earlier about nationhood. If we break it down, there's all kinds of nationhood, like nations of two, and then nations of one. And ultimately Nadia, that's part of her outfit, that's part of her uniform for her nation of one, and it unsettles unwanted men, and it also unsettles a man who's friendly in her life. I think the dress, the way she dresses serves a function in different situations. I think that's kind of what, like Malik was saying, but yeah.
That's a really interesting point, that it's about nationhood.
This is a great question, since you all are teachers. The opening of the novel says, quote, "In cities teetering at the edge of the abyss, young people still go to class." How does the stability of a place affect the way people connect with the world and with each other?
Well, that's one of the ways that I thought, wow, does that ever apply to where we're at right now? But and then my students are they seem more interested than ever in being in class or part of class.
Tijan, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, so I think that at the beginning of the novel, the same as Mark, I have this kind of impression that the situation is very much related to what's happening right now. This kind of instability, this kind of food shortened, and have to go for grocery. I mean, at the early beginning of the pandemic. But what I'm thinking regarding the question itself, I think part of it is about the idea of affiliations. Is even though the condition is very unstable, even though there's so much uncertainty, but there is a place, let's say this is university, or there's a classroom that you can always be there and to meet up certain people that you might feel familiar. I think that the idea about affiliations, it means something in a time that is very uncertain.
Mhm. I think it's also the word teetering at the edge of the abyss. That phrase is very interesting because teetering means not yet fallen, but you have the intimations of about to fall. And so there's a sort of clinging to normality. When you think about the edge of the abyss, you're not in the abyss yet. And I think, you know, you what seems dangerous and fraught at the beginning of the novel quickly becomes the normal as things escalate and become worse, right? And that to me is interesting how our perspectives shift along with the characters. Things that seemed tense, that seemed chaotic, quickly seem the ideal past, a few pages into the novel. So that to
Yeah.
me is, a sign of how skillful a writer Hamid is, that he lets us change our perspective so radically in just a few words.
That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead if anybody else wanted to.
No,
No,
We have another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Abdu.
no, sorry,
Abdul.
please go ahead. I mean, just quickly, I guess I would say I also see in it, some of the fundamental hopefulness that's expressed, that yes, you're clinging to one normal thing, but you're also saying, in case we do get out of this, I'm going to want to have this skill or this talent, or I'm somehow we're going to survive. And I think, there's this idea that, each individual one of us, actually, we know is not going to survive forever, and we don't know when we're going to die, but each one of us is impermanent, but humanity is going to go on, like the city that's going to go on, like the city that's back 50 years from now and in a different place where the children there only think of it as a history that they don't know about. So I think it relates to that fundamental hopefulness, but I think it also really calls to mind this kind of, and I think the novel powerfully affected me in this time because of the pandemic and because of this recognition of, when you recognize that things are transient, that things you used to take for granted. And I think he powerfully brings out that some people are forced to this recognition very early in their lives by the conditions they're born into, by the conditions around them. They're forced to this recognition very early, but everyone has to realize it eventually. No matter how privileged you are, eventually your parents die. Eventually your loved one falls out of love with you. Eventually you realize the deep loss. And maybe because I'm getting older, and maybe because we're in this pandemic, I just felt that this recognition of this deep loss, that everything, even the most beautiful things, are going to come to an end, and you have to try to figure out how to not let that take away from your appreciation of them, was just so powerful for me in this time. Yeah.
That's great. We have a couple more minutes, so I'll just ask a few more questions. These two sort of go together. Somebody asked, how can I use the themes in the book to connect across cultures on a deeper level? I want to continue to grow in this area. We also have a question that says, what parallels do you see in the book to the refugee crisis today, and what could people do to help welcome migrants and refugees?
Yes, Shijai.
I kind of want to paraphrase a Dumoulin comment previously. It's about stereotype. If I hear him correctly, I found that it's so meaningful when Dumoulin mentioned, when Nadia wearing the robe, the meaning changed over the time. And perhaps it's nothing related to the original idea. And when we perceive someone at the first time, unfortunately, a lot of time it's about stereotype. how that person look like, what is the hair, what is the skin tone, what is the attitude, and I think related to that, back to the question itself, what is something helpful as when someone who's not a refugee or a migrant, the very from my perception, the very helpful way to do it is not to stereotype someone, regardless how do they look like. And I think just by that means, it means that trying to, if capable, trying to understand them, trying to know their name, trying to pronounce correctly, trying to, learn about things and be open minded and not apply this previous concept of what the group means or characteristic of a particular group, apply stereotype. I think that will be extremely helpful.
Thank you. Mark, did you want to answer any of the two questions?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say reading poetry and fiction by people who are very different from you and come from very different worlds than you. I have a lot of appreciation for people who like read the history of a place, but I think stories, like I said, the story is the story. I think fiction and poetry delivers information. We'll just call it information that you might not get from the history books. And I always encourage people, read some about, a book by somebody that it's going to take you a while to get used to how they speak and what's going on in the world. But it's a good way to get used to those worlds, right? Yeah.
Thanks. Abdul Malik?
Yeah, I go back to the theme I started with, Lita Arafu, to get to know one another, that we get to know each other through our differences. And I think the process by which you get to know one another is such a beautiful process of living with people, of being with people, of interacting with people. It's not about, as we said, not stereotyping them, not assuming they're all the same if they come from the same place, and that not meet them and asking them straight out. I know that can also be uncomfortable, but because you ask people about intimate, important things when you just met them, and that's very strange. But instead, like you would in any human relationship, you get to know someone, you establish a familiarity, you establish an intimacy, and then those things that the other person reveal themselves to you in a beautiful way, and you get to know who they are. And I do think this idea of wanting to help people, I think, is very powerful. And I think but the help doesn't come as if, oh, these poor people need my help, but as just connecting with people and realizing they have something beautiful to offer you, you have something beautiful to offer them, that we all have something unique to offer each other. And we need to always guard against these feelings of fear, which can be, in a sense, natural. They can be human feelings of fear of the unknown, fear of the different, fear of, if I don't know if I can feed my own family, am I scared of 3 other families moving into the block? But take that, put that to the side. When you actually have relationships and human encounter, I think you find that fear melts away, and you start to focus more on the uniqueness of each individual. It's easy to demonize or be afraid of someone who's just an abstract idea, but when it's a human being who's with you and talking to you, and you have it, then it becomes much more difficult for most of us.
Absolutely.
In a good way.
Is that optimistic or hopeful?
That is hopeful.
It's utopian. Handing it back over to you, Jennifer. Thank you to all the speakers so much.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate everyone being here. Thanks, Shelja, Mark, Jane, Abdul Malik. I want to mention a few upcoming events. As always, we have lots and lots of One Book, One Chicago events around the theme of Beyond Borders that we invite you to come. But I want to mention a few in particular. This Monday, October 19th, we have DePaul's own Francesca Reusker, who's going to do a writing workshop called Crafting Public and Private Spaces in Memoir. So she's getting the thumbs up from Mark there. That's an endorsement. Definitely check that out on our website. Sign up for that. It's going to be wonderful. This upcoming Tuesday, October 20th, we have a program discussing Korean American immigrant stories on film. We encourage you to check that out. And upcoming on Wednesday, October 28th, we're going to have a program for Slow Fashion Month, which is October, Fashion Beyond Borders with Chicago's own Hoda Katevi. So check that out as well. onebook1chicago.org. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks to DePaul University for being such a wonderful partner for so many years to One Book One Chicago. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.